My name is Claire Donovan, and for 27 years, the United States Navy knew exactly who I was. My own family did not. That is the sentence I would have said to my father's face if he had ever asked. He never did. So instead, I stood outside a ballroom at the Officers Club in Norfolk, Virginia, holding a garment bag in one hand and an invitation in the other, and I let the cold March wind answer the question for me. I want to start at the beginning, because the beginning is the only part of this story that makes any of the rest of it make sense. Norfolk raised me the way it raises everyone who grows up inside the fence line of a naval base, with the sound of a bugle at colors every morning, with gray ships on the horizon that never quite looked like they belonged to the sky, and with a father whose voice carried the particular authority of a man who has commanded other men. Captain Robert Donovan retired from the United States Navy after 26 years of surface warfare service, the last 4 of them in command of a guided missile destroyer. In our house, that word, command, was not a job title. It was a religion. My father did not simply believe in the Navy. He believed the Navy was the truest measure of a person's worth, and he measured his own 2 children against it every single day of our lives, whether he meant to or not. My brother Tyler was built for that measurement. He was loud in the way that fills a room, athletic in the way that makes coaches notice, and from the time he could walk, he wanted nothing more than to be exactly what our father already was. When Tyler made varsity swim team at 14, my father took the whole family to dinner. When Tyler got his letter of acceptance to a Navy ROTC scholarship at a state university, not even the Naval Academy, just an ROTC unit, my father wept at the kitchen table. I remember that dinner. I remember the pride on his face like it was carved there. I was different, and for most of my childhood, different meant less. I liked codes. I liked the back pages of my father's old Jane's Fighting Ships annuals, where the silhouettes of warships were printed in black ink, and you had to memorize the shape of a hull to know what you were looking at. I liked crossword puzzles that took me 3 days. I liked the quiet, patient work of taking something scrambled and making it make sense. My mother Margaret used to find me at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, hunched over a cipher I'd built myself out of a paperback spy novel, and she would put a hand on my shoulder and say, "You have your father's mind and none of his volume, Claire. That's not a flaw. Don't you ever let anyone tell you that's a flaw." She said it quietly, though. She always said the kind things quietly, as if she were afraid my father would overhear and correct her. There is one more memory from that era I should tell you about, because it explains something about the shape my ambition eventually took. When I was 14, our school held a mock intelligence briefing exercise as part of a regional civics competition, a strange, ambitious little program some retired officer had designed for local schools, where teams had to analyze a fictional crisis scenario using scattered, contradictory pieces of information and brief a panel of judges on what they believed was actually happening. Most of the other teams tried to guess the big reveal. I built a timeline instead. I cross-referenced every scrap of data against every other scrap until the contradictions themselves told me where the lie was hiding. My team won by a wide margin, and one of the judges, a retired Navy captain who did not know my last name was Donovan, pulled me aside afterward and said, "Young lady, you have the mind for intelligence work, real intelligence work. Don't let anybody talk you out of that." I carried that sentence around for years like a smooth stone in my pocket, taking it out to look at it whenever the house on Wexford Lane made me forget it was true. I never told my father about that competition at all. By then, I had already learned the lesson well enough not to bother. I remember one particular afternoon with painful clarity. I was 16. I had just placed first in a statewide competitive mathematics and cryptography exhibition, beating out students 2 years ahead of me, including several from a magnet school across the state that had never lost a competition before. I brought the certificate home flushed with a kind of pride I didn't yet have the vocabulary for. My father was in the backyard, grilling for a gathering of his old academy friends, and I handed him the certificate right there in front of them, my hands a little unsteady. He looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. Long enough to be polite, not long enough to actually read what it said. "That's nice, Claire," he said, already turning back to the grill. Then, to his friends, with a short laugh, "Tyler broke the base freestyle record last week, 14 years old, and swimming times that'll get him recruited before he's even in high school." I stood there, holding the certificate against my chest like it might stop something from getting in, and I smiled because that was what I had learned to do. I smiled and I went back inside and I put the certificate in a drawer and it stayed there. That was the day I understood in the specific way a 16-year-old understands things, as an ache rather than an idea. That in my father's house there was only one kind of strength that counted. And it was not the kind I had. The living room told the same story every single day, whether anyone meant it to or not. There was a photograph wall by the stairs. My mother updated it every Christmas, and Tyler was always at the center of it. Tyler in his ROTC uniform, Tyler with his swim medals, Tyler shaking my father's hand at his commissioning ceremony, both of them beaming in a way that made the photograph look staged even though it wasn't. I was in some of those pictures too, technically, standing at the edge of the frame, half a shoulder cropped off in one particularly memorable one from my own high school graduation, because the photographer had been trying to fit Tyler's varsity letterman jacket into the shot. I don't say any of this to make my father sound like a villain. He wasn't. He was a man who had been raised inside a very narrow definition of what mattered, and he passed that definition down to his children the way people do, mostly without noticing. Mostly with love that simply couldn't find its way past his own blind spots. That doesn't make the years inside those blind spots hurt any less. It just means the story is sadder than a simple villain would make it. When it came time for me to choose a path, I didn't choose the parade ground. I chose Navy ROTC 2 quietly at a university 2 states away, and I told almost no one what I intended to do with it. I was drawn, pulled, really, in a way I couldn't fully explain even to myself, toward naval intelligence, toward rooms with no windows and screens instead of crowds, toward the part of the service where the battles are invisible and the victories are classified, and where the only person who ever really knows the full shape of what you did is you. My father found out I'd commissioned into intelligence rather than a warfare community, and his only comment, delivered over the phone with the particular flatness he reserved for disappointment, was, "Intelligence, huh? Well, I suppose somebody has to do the paperwork." Ugh, I hung up that phone and didn't call him again for 4 months. What my father called paperwork consumed the next 27 years of my life, and it very nearly cost me my life twice. I won't describe every operation. Most of them are still classified, and some of them will stay that way until long after I'm gone. But I can tell you about 3, because enough time has passed and because you need to understand the weight of what I was carrying into that ballroom in Norfolk. The first was called Operation Iron Shield. I was a lieutenant commander then, 11 years in, assigned to a joint task force monitoring threats to carrier strike group communications. 36 hours without meaningful sleep, tracking a cyber intrusion that had already begun quietly rerouting navigational data on a carrier steaming through contested waters. If we had been an hour slower, the strike group would have been sailing partially blind through a corridor known for aggressive intercepts. 5,000 sailors aboard that ship never knew how close it came. We stopped it. The carrier schedule didn't change by so much as a day. Nobody outside a small secure room in Norfolk ever knew what almost happened, and nobody was ever supposed to. The second was Operation Silent Echo, a special operations element. A small team, not the 300 you might picture, just 8 men, was compromised behind enemy lines, their communications jammed, extraction window closing. I was the intelligence officer who, working through my chain of command, pushed an emergency reprioritization of overhead intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance assets through the combatant command, buying that team a narrow, precious window of coverage they needed to move undetected to an alternate extraction point. All 8 came home. Officially, their survival was attributed to skill and a measure of luck. Unofficially, 6 months later, I received a folded letter through channels that took considerable effort to identify me at all. It read, in handwriting that looked like it had been written by someone unused to writing anything longer than a report, "We're alive because of you. A man doesn't forget that." I have kept that letter in the same drawer for 15 years. It has moved with me through 4 duty stations. The third was Operation Midnight Falcon, coordinated with Allied Maritime Services, tracking a cargo vessel suspected of transporting unsecured radiological material through international shipping lanes. That one ended quietly too, an intercept, a transfer of custody, a story that never made a single headline because the entire point of doing it well was that nobody would ever need to write about it. A younger officer on my current staff, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, once asked me during a long night shift a few years ago, the 2 of us the only ones left in a secure spaces bullpen at 2 in the morning, waiting on a report. Neither of us could leave until it was finalized, what it was actually like. doing this work for so many years without anyone outside a locked door ever knowing. It's a strange kind of loneliness, I told her honestly, because she had earned an honest answer by that point in her career. You save something, or someone, and then you go home and you sit at a dinner table with people who love you and have no idea what your day was actually made of. You learn to hold two entirely separate lives in the same body. Most people never have to do that. It costs you something. Over the years, even when the work itself is worth every bit of the cost. Does it get easier? She'd asked. No, I said, but you get better at carrying it. That's not the same thing as easier, it's just steadier. She'd nodded slowly, the way people do when they're filing something away to remember on a harder night of their own, and neither of us had said much else for the rest of that shift. I think of that conversation often. I thought of it again, months later, standing in a hallway in Norfolk holding a folder that wasn't mine to read. None of my medals came with the ceremony. They came in sealed envelopes, delivered to a secure facility, logged, and stored. My proudest possession was a letter from a man I never met, tucked in a drawer that nobody in my family had ever opened. And through all of it, the promotions that came slowly and quietly, lieutenant to lieutenant commander, to commander to captain, my family's understanding of my career never grew past the words my father had used on that phone call 20 years earlier. To them, I pushed paper. I sat behind a desk. My mother knew a little more, in the vague, worried way mothers sense things they aren't told. My father and Tyler knew almost nothing at all, because they had never once asked, and I had stopped volunteering information into a silence that never seemed to want it. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters to everything that happens later. I did try 3 separate times over the years to close that distance myself. The first time was my promotion to commander, 14 years into my career. I mailed a formal invitation to the ceremony to my parents' house 6 weeks in advance. My father called to say he had a golf commitment with his old academy classmates that he couldn't reasonably break. My mother wanted to come alone. He told her it would look strange for only one parent to attend, and so, in the quiet, conflict-averse way she managed most disagreements in that house, she stayed home too. The second time was my promotion to captain, 22 years in. I called this time instead of mailing anything, thinking a voice might carry more weight than paper. My father congratulated me for exactly 11 seconds and then asked whether I'd heard that Tyler had just been selected for department head. I hadn't. I congratulated him too, sincerely, because I loved my brother even when I resented the room he took up. Neither of my parents came to that ceremony either. The third time, I didn't send an invitation at all. I told myself it was because I was too busy. That wasn't the truth. The truth was that I had run out of whatever it takes inside a person to keep extending an open hand into an empty room. So when I say that my family did not know about the quiet frocking ceremony that made me a 1-star admiral, and then 18 months later a 2-star rear admiral, upper half, I need you to understand that this was not entirely their blindness. It was also, in some measure, my retreat. Flag officer promotions in the Navy are a matter of public record. They run through Senate confirmation. They appear in official channels. They are announced. But in my particular line of work, initial assumption of duties at a new flag rank is sometimes handled through what's informally called quiet frocking. You assume the insignia and the responsibilities of the higher grade ahead of the formal confirmation process, especially when the position itself sits inside a compartmented need-to-know program. My promotion was real, it was earned, and it existed in records my father could have found in an afternoon if he had ever thought to look. He never looked, and I, by then, had stopped expecting him to. That is the wound underneath the wound. Not that they didn't know, that they never once wondered enough to ask. My father retired from active affiliation with the base entirely, his last formal tie to the Navy, the spring I turned 49. The ceremony was to be held at the Officers Club at Naval Station Norfolk, not a change of command, not a full military retirement review, but a private reception thrown by his old wardroom friends and family to mark the occasion. Invitations were handled by the family, meaning, in practice, that my father controlled the guest list personally. I found out about it from my mother in a phone call she made when my father wasn't home. Her voice had that careful, lowered quality it always took on when she was doing something she suspected he wouldn't approve of. "There's a reception, Claire. March the 14th. I want you there. I already asked him to add you to the list. He said he would. He did not." I drove to the base that morning with my dress whites folded in a garment bag on the back seat of my car. A habit, honestly, more than a plan. I had learned years earlier to bring a uniform to anything involving my family, because you never knew when the day might turn into something that required it, and because if I'm being truthful with myself, some quiet, stubborn part of me always hoped it might. The base itself was easy to enter. I am an active duty flag officer with a valid identification card, and no security checkpoint on a naval installation questions that. The confusion, and I want to be precise here because precision matters, happened at the door of the private reception hall itself, where a young ensign stood with a tablet checking names against a list controlled not by base security, but by my father's event coordinator. I gave my name. Civilian clothes, because I hadn't yet decided whether I was staying. The ensign scanned the list twice. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, and his face was genuinely apologetic, the particular helplessness of a junior officer caught between two things he can't fix. "I don't see a Claire Donovan on the guest list." Through the glass panel beside the door, I could see the room. Banners. Polished brass. My father near the center of it, laughing at something, his hand resting on the shoulder of an old friend, wearing the posture of a man enjoying without reservation, being the center of a room built entirely around him. My mother stood near the drink table, watching the door, watching for me, I would learn later, with an expression that never quite settled into ease. And near the head table, in his own dress uniform, stood my brother Tyler. A lieutenant commander now, department head aboard a destroyer, tall and easy in his posture, the way my father had always wanted a Donovan to look. Someone was pinning a small ribbon on his chest, recognition for something, I didn't yet know what. And the small crowd around him applauded warmly. My father's eyes crossed mine through the glass for perhaps a second and a half. He didn't wave. He didn't come to the door. He simply held my gaze for that second and a half with an expression I have turned over in my mind many times since. And then he turned back to his friends. And the conversation continued exactly where it had left off, as though nothing on the other side of that glass required his attention at all. I want to tell you, I felt rage in that moment. What I actually felt was smaller and older than rage. It was the particular familiar ache of being 16 years old again, standing in a backyard with a certificate no one wanted to read. I thanked the ensign, it wasn't his fault, and I told him so. And I walked back to the parking lot, my heels steady on the pavement in a way that took more effort than it should have. I did not, in fact, leave the base. Instead, I found a side entrance near the kitchen staff area, a door propped open for catering deliveries, and I let myself into the building through it, not with any plan beyond wanting for a few minutes to simply watch. I told myself I only wanted to see my father's face on the day he'd worked his whole career toward. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything else. I found it anyway. On a folding table near the coat check, among stacks of programs and a box of unused name placards, sat a thin folder that had clearly slid out of someone's binder and been left behind. I almost walked past it. I don't fully know, even now, what made me stop and open it. Call it 27 years of training my eyes to notice the document that doesn't belong in the stack. It was the event coordinator's working file, seating charts, a vendor invoice, and 3 pages in, an email printout. A short internal note from my father to the coordinator dated 11 days earlier. Please finalize guest list per attached. 1 correction, remove Claire Donovan from reception list B. Family will handle separately. Do not want any distraction from Tyler's recognition today. This is his day. RD. I read it twice. Then I read the phrase, "do not want any distraction from Tyler's recognition" a third time, because some sentences require a third reading before the body will accept what the eyes have already understood. It was not an oversight. My mother had asked him to add me, and he had gone out of his way, composed an email, sent it 11 days in advance to remove me instead, and to frame my own presence at my father's retirement as a potential distraction for my brother's ribbon ceremony. I stood very still in that hallway for a long moment, the folder open in my hands, the sound of the reception murmuring faintly through the wall. I want to be honest. It was not the guest list itself that broke something in me. It was the deliberateness of it. 49 years of being an afterthought I could carry, and had carried, quietly, for most of my adult life. A single sentence, written in my father's own clipped, decisive prose, confirming that the afterthought had been on purpose. That was different. That reached all the way down, past the calm professional exterior I had spent a career building, down to the same 16-year-old girl who had once stood in a backyard holding a certificate nobody wanted to read. I have run intelligence assessments under far greater pressure than a folded piece of paper on a coat check table. I have kept my hands steady while briefing admirals on threats that could reshape a region overnight. And yet I stood in that hallway and had to consciously remind myself to breathe, because there is a particular kind of damage that only the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can do. And no amount of professional composure fully inoculates you against it. Training teaches you to manage a crisis. It does not teach you how to manage your own father's handwriting, confirming in 6 words exactly how little space he had ever intended to make for you. I slid the folder back exactly as I'd found it, because that is simply how I am built, and I walked toward the exit near the kitchen, needing air. I nearly made it outside cleanly. I would have if I hadn't recognized my brother's voice around the corner by the loading dock, low and urgent in a way I had never once heard from him. "If Claire shows up," Tyler was saying to someone I couldn't see, "it changes everything. It always does. She doesn't even have to try. I've spent my whole career trying to be half of what people already assume about her, and she's never even in the room." A second voice, a friend of his, I didn't recognize, said something too quiet for me to catch, something conciliatory. "You don't understand," Tyler said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word understand. "Dak talks about her like she's nothing, and everyone believes it, and I used to believe it too. And then I made department head last year, and the XO pulled me aside and said, 'Your sister ever tell you what she actually does?' And I said, 'No, because she never has, because none of us ever ask.' And he looked at me like I was an idiot for not knowing. Like everyone already knew something I didn't. I don't even know what I'm competing with. That's the worst part. I've spent my whole life competing with a woman I don't actually know." I stood against the cool cinder block wall of that hallway, with my hand pressed flat against my chest over a heart that was working harder than it should have been for a woman standing perfectly still. And I understood something new. It was not only my father who had built a wall to keep me out of that family story. My brother had been standing on the other side of it too, afraid of me in a way I had never once suspected, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything I had actually done to him. I thought back, standing there, to 100 small moments I had never fully examined before, Tyler declining, year after year, to sit with me at family gatherings for more than a few polite minutes at a time. Tyler steering conversations quickly away from any question about my career. Tyler's easy laugh, which I had always read as simple confidence, and which I now understood hearing the crack in his voice by that loading dock, might have been armor the whole time. Worn so long he'd forgotten it was armor at all. I had spent decades assuming my brother's ease in that family was proof he had never once doubted his place in it. It had never once occurred to me that his ease might have been the most exhausting performance in the entire house, more exhausting even than my own long practice of smiling through a certificate no one wanted to read. We had both, I realized, been fighting the same silence from opposite sides of it, and neither of us had ever thought to ask the other what it cost. I slipped out through the loading dock before either of them saw me, my hand closing around the edge of my coat pocket where, from habit, from that same old stubbornness, I had tucked a folded, worn letter that read, "We're alive because of you." A man doesn't forget that. I stood in the parking lot a long moment breathing the cold Virginia air, and I thought about walking to my car and simply driving home. It would have been the easier story. It would also, I understood with sudden and total clarity, have been the same story I had been living since I was 16 years old, standing in a backyard holding a certificate no one wanted to read. Not this time. I sat in my car in the Officers Club parking lot for 11 minutes before I called Vice Admiral Thomas Ellis. Admiral Ellis had been my mentor for nearly 2 decades, a friend of my father's from their academy days. Though the two men had drifted apart over the years, the way old classmates sometimes do when their paths diverge. He was the officer who had quietly sponsored my selection to flag rank, who had sat across from me 18 months earlier and told me without ceremony that my frocking to 2 stars had been approved and would take effect immediately given the sensitivity of my current assignment. He also happened, and I had not fully processed this fact until I was sitting in that parking lot, to be the guest of honor scheduled to deliver remarks at my father's retirement reception in less than 30 minutes. He picked up on the second ring. "Claire, I was about to walk into your father's event. Everything all right?" I told him, Not everything, not the argument I'd overheard, not entirely, but enough that I'd been quietly removed from the guest list, that I'd found the note confirming it wasn't an accident. There was a long pause on the line. When Admiral Ellis spoke again, his voice had shifted into something I recognized from operations rooms, not social calls. Flat, precise, entirely without sentiment. "Your father doesn't know I selected you for '08, he said. Does he? No, sir. He doesn't know about Silent Echo or Midnight Falcon. No, sir." Another pause. "Then it's time somebody besides me did," Admiral Ellis said. "Put your uniform on, Claire. Come inside. I'll make sure the door isn't a problem. Sir, I don't want this to become a spectacle at my father's expense. This is still his day." "It was his day," Admiral Ellis said, not unkindly, "right up until he decided your absence was part of the program. You're not walking in there to take anything from him, Claire. You're walking in there because you've earned the right to be seen, and he doesn't get to keep deciding otherwise. That decision was never actually his to make. 27 years, and he still doesn't know who raised." I sat with the phone against my ear for a moment, watching my own reflection faintly in the windshield glass. "Yes, sir," I said finally. "Give me 10 minutes. I changed in the women's restroom off the officers' club lobby, not, despite what I might once have imagined doing, in some more theatrical version of this story, in the front seat of my car in a parking lot. There is a version of this story where the drama of that image might have felt satisfying to write. There is no version of it that would have been true to who I actually am, or dignified enough for the moment I was about to walk into. 27 years teaches you the difference between a dramatic gesture and an earned one. I want to describe this moment slowly because it deserves more than a single rushed sentence. It was the hinge on which 27 years turned, and I have never wanted to rush through it since. I hung the garment bag on the hook behind the door and looked, for a moment, at the uniform inside it before I put it on. Dress whites, pressed with a precision that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with respect for what the cloth represented. 2 silver stars, small and unassuming on the shoulder boards, easy to overlook if you didn't know what you were looking at, and utterly unmistakable if you did. I buttoned each closure slowly, not for effect, because my hands, for the first time in longer than I could remember, were not entirely steady, and slow was the only way to make sure I did it right. When I pinned the stars onto my shoulders, I felt the weight settle the way I always did, not as a burden, the way outsiders sometimes assume, but as a kind of ballast. Proof, carry quietly, of every 3 a.m. shift, every operation whose success nobody outside a locked room would ever know about. Every year I had shown up for a country that did not require my family's permission to matter. I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. Gone was the woman standing outside a glass door waiting to be let in. In her place stood Rear Admiral Claire Donovan, and there was no version of that reflection that could be told, again, that she didn't belong in the room. My phone buzzed once in my hand. A message from Admiral Ellis, "Doors clear, whenever you're ready." I set my cover on my head, checked the line of it once in the mirror, and I whispered, not for anyone else to hear, just for myself. Because some sentences you have to say out loud before you can believe them, not for revenge, for the truth. Then I opened the door. The reception hall was mid-toast when I stepped inside. Admiral Ellis stood near the podium, having just finished introducing my father, and the room had that particular hush of an audience settling in to listen to a man they respected talk about a career they admired. My father stood beside the podium, wine glass raised halfway, his face already arranged into the expression he wore for cameras. The door didn't slam behind me. It simply closed, quiet and final, and the sound of it carried farther through that hushed room than I expected. I walked forward. I did not walk quickly, and I did not walk slowly. I walked the way 27 years teaches you to walk into any room, level, unhurried, present. Heads turned first near the back, then in a slow wave toward the front, conversation dying out, table by table like a candle being pinched section by section down a long wick. Near the front, at a table of enlisted and senior enlisted personnel from the base, men and women who serve as the Officers Club's honor guard detail for retirement functions, a man rose from his seat. I recognized him before I fully processed why. Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reyes, retired now, his face weathered in the particular way of men who have spent careers in places the rest of us will never be told about. 15 years earlier, he had been the senior enlisted man on the 8-man element I had helped extract during Operation Silent Echo. I had never met him in person. I had only ever known his name from an after-action report and a folded letter I still carried in my coat pocket. He came to his feet slowly, deliberately, and called out in a voice built for carrying across open water, "Attention on deck!" The response was immediate and total. Every uniformed person in that room rose as one, chairs scraping back in a single rolling wave of sound. The reflexive discipline of years of training overriding whatever confusion any individual officer might have felt. Even those who had no idea who I was came to attention, because that is what the command means, and because discipline does not wait for explanation. For a moment, the entire hall stood in silence, 100-some uniforms locked at attention, and into that silence, Master Chief Reyes said, quietly enough that only those nearest heard it clearly, "That's the officer who got my team home. 15 years, and I finally get to say thank you to her face." The microphone at the podium slipped from the Master of Ceremonies' hand and struck the floor with a sharp, ringing crack that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. I found my father's face across the room. The wineglass in his hand had gone still, tilted at an angle that suggested he had entirely forgotten he was holding it. The color had drained from his face in a way I had genuinely never seen on him before. Not at any funeral, not at any crisis I could remember from my childhood. He looked, for the first time in my entire life, like a man who did not know what to do with his own hands. Beside him, Tyler stood frozen, his lips slightly parted, his eyes moving from the stars on my shoulders to my face and back again, as though his mind were trying and failing to reconcile two images of the same person. I kept walking, unhurried, not toward vindication. I understood that even in that moment, but simply toward the front of a room that, for the first time in my life, could not look away. I stopped near the front row, turned, and lowered myself into an empty seat rather than taking the podium. I want to be clear about why. I had not come to give a speech. I had not come to correct the record in front of an audience, or to force my father into a public accounting he hadn't chosen. I had simply come to stop disappearing. Admiral Ellis, recovering the fallen microphone himself, cleared his throat once and addressed the room with the calm authority of a man who has given 1,000 briefings under worse conditions. For those who don't already know, he said, "Rear Admiral Claire Donovan has served this Navy for 27 years, the last several of them at the 2-star level in a role I am not at liberty to fully describe, except to say that this country is safer today because of decisions she made in rooms most of us will never be cleared to enter. I have had the honor of knowing her work, and I can tell you plainly, some of the men and women standing in this room right now are alive because of missions she ran. I did not know until an hour ago that her own family did not know that too. I suspect that's about to change." A vice admiral I recognized from the base staff rose from a nearby table and crossed the room to shake my hand, his grip firm, his voice pitched low and warm. "It's good to finally put a face to the name behind the reports I'd been reading for 3 years, Admiral." Another officer followed, then another. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a young officer from my own current staff whom I hadn't even realized was present, likely there as part of the base honor detail, caught my eye from across the room and gave a small, private smile, the kind that says, "I always knew, even when you couldn't tell anyone." I folded my cover into my lap and sat with my back straight, my face composed, and I let the room do what it needed to do without requiring anything further from me. From the corner of my vision, I watched my father. He had not moved from his spot near the podium. The wineglass trembled faintly in his hand, and for a long moment, I genuinely could not tell whether he intended to set it down or simply let it fall. Tyler had folded himself into his chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as though it might offer him an explanation the rest of the room couldn't. And then, from somewhere near the back, I never learned who started it, a single pair of hands began to clap. Hesitant at first, uncertain of the room's mood. Then another. Then a swelling wave of applause there rolled forward unprompted by any program, unsummoned by any master of ceremonies. Pulled instead from a room full of people who had just been handed a truth they hadn't expected and found they couldn't set back down. I did not stand for it. I simply sat, hands folded over my cover, and let myself, for the first time in as long as I could remember, be fully and undeniably seen. I want to try to describe what that felt like, because I don't think I fully understood it myself until much later. It was not triumph exactly, though there was something in it that resembled triumph's quieter cousin. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a piece of luggage you have carried so long you forgot your shoulder was aching under the weight of it. A strange, disorienting lightness, mixed with the almost unbearable urge to cry, which I did not allow myself to do in that room, though I came close twice. An older woman I didn't recognize seated 2 tables away caught my eye during the applause and simply pressed her hand flat against her own chest and nodded at me once. The universal gesture of one woman to another that means I see what that cost you, and I'm glad you're still standing. I have thought about that stranger more than once since. Somewhere behind me, I heard Master Chief Reyes say quietly to the officer beside him, 15 years I've been telling that story without a name to put on it. Feels different having the name now. I turned in my seat and our eyes met across the room and he gave me a short, solemn nod, the kind exchange between 2 people who have both spent long stretches of their lives inside rooms other people never get to see. The applause thinned into the low murmur of a reception trying to remember how to be a reception again. Servers resumed circulating, conversations restarted in careful, quieter registers. I stepped out into the hallway near the coat check, the same hallway where I had read my father's email an hour earlier, needing a moment away from the weight of 200 eyes. Tyler found me there first. He stood a few feet away for a moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual ease. "How long," he said, "have you been?" He gestured vaguely at my shoulders, unable to finish the sentence. 27 years in the Navy, I said. 2-star, 18 months. He absorbed that the way a man absorbs a blow he half expected and still wasn't braced for. "I heard you," he said finally. "By the loading dock. I don't know if you heard me, but I saw you leave through the kitchen. I figured you heard some of it. I heard enough." Ugh. He pressed the heels of his hands briefly against his eyes. I've spent my whole career being told, without anyone ever quite saying it out loud, that I was standing in somebody's shadow. I just never knew whose. And it turns out it was yours, and you never once tried to make me feel small. I did that to myself, comparing myself to a ghost. He dropped his hands. "I'm sorry, Claire. Not just for today. For all of it, for never asking. You're allowed to have your own career, Tyler," I said, and I meant it. You earned your rank. Nobody handed you department head because of me. I'd like it if, eventually, you actually got to know me instead of competing with an idea of me nobody ever bothered to check. He nodded, and for the first time since I could remember, my brother looked at me not with the wary calculation of a rival, but with something closer to plain curiosity. "Okay," he said quietly, "I'd like that too." He hesitated, then added almost sheepishly, "For what it's worth, that Master Chief calling out 'attention on deck' like that. I don't think I've ever felt smaller and prouder in the same 5 seconds in my whole life." I stood up because 30 years of training told my body to stand up before my brain even caught up with what was happening. And then I looked at you walking down that aisle, and some part of me that's been competing with a ghost since I was about 9 years old just stopped. It just stopped, Claire. I don't really know how to explain it better than that. "You don't have to explain it," I said. I felt something similar the first time I understood what it cost you, standing on the other side of a competition nobody ever asked you to enter. He huffed out a short laugh, more relief than humor. "Mom's going to want us to have dinner together every week now, fair warning." "I think I'd like that," I told him, and meant it. My father came a few minutes later, after Tyler had gone to find our mother. He didn't speak right away. He stood a short distance off, his eyes moving over the uniform he had once told me was not a commission, lingering on the stars he had never known existed until an hour ago. 27 years, he said finally, and his voice had lost the flat authority it always carried in that house. "I told people you pushed paper. You did. I told people that at your own graduation dinner." He looked, briefly, like a man trying to swallow something too large. "I have been telling people that for 27 years, Claire, and I never once, not once, asked you to tell me otherwise." I didn't answer right away. There is a temptation, in a moment like that, to fill the silence for the other person. To make it easier on them the way I had spent a lifetime making things easier on him. I chose, for the first time, not to. "You know what the strangest part is," he said. Before I could respond, his voice dropping into something almost bewildered. "I spent my whole career teaching young officers that intelligence work was the backbone of every operation I ever ran. I used to brief my own department heads on how a strike group is only as good as the picture we have of the water around it. I believed that. I taught it. And somehow I never once let myself apply that same respect to my own daughter's work, because I'd already decided, before you were even out of high school, what kind of career would and wouldn't count in this family. He shook his head slowly. That's not something I can blame on not knowing, Claire. That's something I did to myself and to you on purpose 100 small times over 27 years. He set down the wineglass on a side table, finally, both hands empty. I don't have a way to make up 27 years, he said. I know that. I'm not going to stand here and pretend an apology fixes it. But I am sorry, not for the guest list, though I am sorry for that too, more than you probably believe right now. I'm sorry that I built a house where you had to become an admiral in secret before I'd think to ask who you actually were. It wasn't the apology I might have written for him if I'd been given the chance to script it. It was better in its way because it was clumsy and unrehearsed and entirely his own. Thank you for saying that, I told him. It matters. It doesn't undo it, but it matters. He nodded once. Slowly, the same deliberate nod I had watched him give subordinates at the end of a hard debrief. The nod of a man accepting a report he didn't want to hear, because refusing to accept it wouldn't make it less true. My mother found me last after the hallway had emptied. I want to give her more room in this story than she is usually given in stories like mine, because for most of my life, my mother existed in the margins of our family's narrative the same way I did, present, watching, rarely given the floor. She had spent 31 years married to a man whose certainty filled every available space in a room, and she had learned, the way many people of her generation learned, to manage disagreement quietly rather than confront it directly. That was not the woman who approached me in the hallway. I asked him to put you on that list, she said without preamble, her voice steadier than I had heard it in years. I asked him twice. I want you to know that I asked. I know, Mom. I should have driven over here myself this morning and told that boy at the door you were coming whether your father liked it or not. Her jaw was set in a way I didn't recognize. I have spent 3 decades letting your father decide which parts of this family got to be visible, and I let him do it to you more than anyone, and I am done being quiet about that, Claire. I am finished. I reached out and took her hand, and for a moment, neither of us said anything at all, because some understanding doesn't need to be spoken to be complete. You were never invisible to me, she said finally. I want you to know that too. I saw you. I just never had the courage in that house to say it loud enough for it to matter to anyone but you. She squeezed my hand. I'm going to have the courage now. Better 30 years late than never at all. 6 months after that reception, I drove back to Norfolk for a Sunday dinner, an ordinary one, the kind my family hadn't managed to have together, all 4 of us, in longer than any of us wanted to admit. The house was unchanged in the ways that houses like that never really change. The same weathered flag hanging by the porch, the same smell of my mother's roast drifting from the kitchen when I opened the front door. But the photograph wall by the stairs was different. Tyler's Naval Academy portrait, he'd finally gotten around to a formal one, still hung near the top, but beside it now, in a frame my mother had chosen herself, hung the photograph of me at the reception, 2 silver stars catching the light, and beneath it, in the glass cabinet in the living room where Tyler's swim trophies had lived unchallenged for 2 decades, sat one of my service medals, its ribbon straightened with obvious deliberate care. My mother told me later that she had put it there herself the week after the reception without asking my father first. I decided, she said simply, that this house was going to tell the truth from now on, whether or not everyone in it was entirely comfortable with it. At dinner, my father asked me questions he had never once asked in 27 years, not the vague obligatory kind, but real ones about how intelligence assessments moved up a chain of command, about what it actually meant to lead a staff the size of mine, about whether the work ever let me sleep at night. He listened to the answers. He didn't interrupt to redirect the conversation toward Tyler. That, more than any single sentence he could have said, told me something had genuinely shifted. Tyler, across the table, was quieter than I'd ever known him to be, but it was a different kind of quiet than the anxious silence I'd overheard by the loading dock. It was the quiet of a man no longer performing for an audience, listening instead. At one point he caught my eye and grinned, the old easy grin I remembered from childhood before either of us had learned to measure ourselves against each other. You know, he said, I've spent my whole career hoping somebody would say I reminded them of you. I just never had the guts to say that out loud until about 6 months ago. You didn't need to remind anyone of me, Tyler, I said. You are always your own officer. I just wish we'd figured that out a lot sooner. Driving home that night under a dark Virginia sky, I caught my own reflection for a moment in the rearview mirror at a stoplight. I looked for the shadow that had followed me through most of my life. The 16-year-old girl standing in a backyard with a certificate no one wanted to read. The woman standing outside a glass door waiting to be let in. I didn't find her. What looked back at me instead was simply whole and steady and entirely undeniable. I thought about the letter still folded in my coat pocket, the one that had traveled with me through 4 duty stations and one very long afternoon in a hallway in Norfolk. We're alive because of you. A man doesn't forget that. Neither, I understood now, driving home in the dark, would I? The greatest acknowledgement I ever received did not come from a ballroom full of applause or from a wall of photographs, finally rearranged to include me though. I will not pretend those things didn't matter. They did. More than I expected them to. It came from the simple, hard-won understanding that I had never actually needed anyone's permission to be who I already was. I'd been an admiral, quietly, for 18 months before that room ever knew it. I'd been someone worth knowing for 27 years before my family ever thought to ask. I think, too, about Master Chief Reyes, who told me at the end of that reception that he'd requested to be assigned to base honor detail duties specifically for retirement events in the hope that someday, somewhere, he might run into someone from Silent Echo without ever knowing it in advance. You don't get to say thank you to a name in a file, he told me, shaking my hand for the second time that night. I've been waiting 15 years for the chance to say it to a face. I told him it was I who owed the thanks, that his team's survival was the only ending I had ever actually needed. Medal or no medal, family or no family. He didn't seem to believe that entirely. I'm not sure I fully believed it myself, not until I said it out loud to him and heard how true it sounded leaving my mouth. I think about my mother most of all though, about a woman who spent 31 years learning how to be quiet in her own home and who found on one ordinary Sunday afternoon that she still had a voice worth using. I don't know that I ever properly thanked her for that hallway conversation. I think I will, the next time I see her. Some debts are worth naming out loud, even years late. The truth doesn't need to be witnessed to be real, but it certainly helps, after a long enough silence, to finally be seen. I turned onto the highway toward home, the silver stars still pinned to my shoulders in the seat beside me, folded now into their case for the drive, and for the first time, in longer than I could remember, I drove without needing to prove anything to anyone at all.